Once upon a time, these words have been a part of our lives for centuries, invoking images of magical realms, heroic adventures, and fantastical creatures. We all grew up on fairy tales, the kind that spark joy and comfort with their reassuring endings. But have you ever wondered what these stories were truly meant to convey? What if I told you that beneath the seemingly innocent layers of princesses and happy endings, there are dark and twisted truths, stories of betrayal, violence, and even death? Welcome to the real origins of fairy tales, where the darkness is as real as the fairy dust. Step into a world of discovery, into the shadowy past of fairy tales, where we uncover secrets so dark, they'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the bedtime stories of your childhood. Are you ready to discover the hidden truths behind the fairy tales you thought you loved? Let's start with Little Red Riding Hood. We all know the story of a sweet, innocent girl walking through the woods to visit her grandmother. Along the way, she meets a cunning wolf who tricks her, and the story ends with a heroic huntsman saving the day. But the original versions of this story, they were far less about heroism and much more about fear and survival. The first known versions of Little Red Riding Hood were far more gruesome. In some, Little Red is devoured by the wolf, and in others, there's no rescue at all. The wolf, symbolic of predators in society, represents the dangers lurking in the wilderness. The original tale wasn't a charming story about a girl outsmarting a wolf, but rather a grim warning about the dangers young girls faced when stepping outside the protective boundaries of their home. And the red hood she wears? It's no innocent color. It represents blood, danger, and even the onset of puberty, signaling a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. The forest itself is a dangerous place, where innocent wanderers could be preyed upon by those lurking in the dark. By the way, if you're planning a solo hike in the woods anytime soon, maybe leave the bright red cape at home. Trust me, it might attract more than just wolves. Little Red Riding Hood, in its original form, served as a cautionary tale for girls to stay within the protection of the family home, to avoid the dangerous and predatory world outside. And as for the huntsman who saves the day, in some versions of the story, he wasn't even present to save her. Little Red and her grandmother were simply eaten by the wolf, as the message was that some dangers, once encountered, were irreversible. Now let's turn our attention to one of the most iconic fairy tales, Cinderella. We all know the version. Cinderella, the downtrodden girl, finally winning the heart of a prince. But did you know that the origins of Cinderella's tale are rooted in brutality, envy, and a surprising amount of bloodshed? In the earliest retellings, the stepsisters were far more gruesome in their attempts to marry the prince. In Charles Perrault's version, the stepsisters try to fit into the glass slipper, but they are forced to cut off parts of their feet. One cuts off her big toe, while the other slices off her heel. Why? Because in this twisted tale, the slipper represents the ideal of feminine purity, a concept that forces women to mutilate themselves just to belong. The true horror, however, lies in how the story ends. The stepsisters aren't forgiven, as they are in modern retellings. Instead, birds peck out their eyes, leaving them blind as punishment for their cruelty. What is the true message behind Cinderella? It isn't just a tale of transformation or love. It's a warning about the dangers of vanity, greed, and jealousy, a theme that was far too real for the people living in medieval times. In a world where social class defined one's fate, Cinderella's ascension to royalty wasn't just a dream. It was an act of defiance against the very forces that had oppressed her. By the way, next time you complain about those tight shoes, just remember, at least they're not cutting off your toes to fit them. The darker side of Cinderella shows how the fairy tale evolved from a story about hope and escape into a stark reminder of the lengths people were willing to go to in order to escape oppression. The gruesome actions of the stepsisters are a metaphor for the lengths some people will go to in order to attain power, wealth, and status, and the price they must pay for those desires. Let's take a moment to look at Snow White, a tale that is more about envy and revenge than it is about beauty and innocence. Today we know Snow White as a girl with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. But in the original version, Snow White's story was filled with tragedy, jealousy, and a mother's obsessive desire to remain the fairest of them all. The real-life inspiration for Snow White is believed to be a noblewoman named Margaretha von Waldeck. She was the daughter of a German count and lived in the 16th century. It is said that her stepmother, who was consumed by envy, ordered Margaretha's murder to ensure she was the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. But the true horror lies in how Margaretha's beauty was exploited and ultimately led to her death. She was poisoned, and her body was placed in a glass coffin. Snow White's ultimate return to life, then, is not a fairy tale ending, but a chilling metaphor for the deadly power of envy. If I had a mirror that could tell me I was the fairest of them all, I'd be a bit worried about what it would ask me to do next. Maybe a few too many apples. The Snow White tale, as we know it today, strips away the bloodshed and the greed. But in its early forms, it was a story of deadly jealousy, with a mother willing to kill her own daughter to preserve her beauty. The glass coffin represents both the isolation of beauty and the finality of death. It's a chilling reminder that beauty can be a curse, and that envy will stop at nothing to maintain power. Now, let's examine Beauty and the Beast. We've been taught to view this as a heartwarming tale of love conquering all. But what if I told you that at its core, it's a disturbing reflection of manipulation and captivity? The Beast is not just a hideous creature, he's a captor, and Beauty's love for him? Well, it's more complex than mere affection. It's a survival mechanism. In the original French version of the tale by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont, Beauty is trapped in the Beast's palace and must stay there, despite her obvious fear and resentment. The Beast's enchanted state serves as a metaphor for toxic relationships, where power and control are hidden behind a veneer of love. Beauty's eventual love for the Beast? It's not true romance, but rather a form of emotional captivity, a bond formed through coercion, isolation, and dependency. I can't say I'd be too keen on falling in love with a guy who has the ability to turn into a literal beast. Maybe she should have called for a second opinion. Beauty and the Beast serves as a cautionary tale about how power dynamics shape relationships. It's less about finding a soulmate, and more about how the boundaries of love and control can be blurred in extreme circumstances. The Beast is a symbol of power, and Beauty's feelings toward him, no matter how genuine they seem, are born out of necessity and fear. Let's shift gears to Sleeping Beauty. The tale of a beautiful princess cursed to sleep for 100 years has been romanticized in countless retellings. But in the original versions, Sleeping Beauty is far from a fairy tale of romance. Instead, it is a story of violation, trauma, and a grim fate. In earlier iterations, such as the one told by Giambattista Basile, the princess is not awakened by a kiss, but by a violent assault. A king discovers the sleeping princess, and unable to rouse her, rapes her while she sleeps. Later, she gives birth to twins, and the only thing that awakens her is when one of the babies sucks the cursed splinter from her finger, which was the cause of her deep slumber in the first place. This grotesque awakening completely changes the meaning of the story. It's no longer about the triumph of true love, but rather a shocking commentary on the vulnerability of women, the violation of innocence, and the chaotic consequences of power. The idea of a woman being helpless in her sleep, both physically and metaphorically, reveals the darker side of societal views towards women in the past. Honestly, after that last detail, I think I'd be perfectly fine staying in a deep sleep for 100 years. Or at least until we get a more pleasant version of true love's kiss. In the case of Sleeping Beauty, we see a horrifying and surreal parallel to the very real issues women faced throughout history. The princess, trapped in an eternal slumber, represents the way women were often silenced and ignored by patriarchal systems. Her awakening is violent, invasive, and traumatic, far from the romanticized notion we associate with the tale today. It's a stark reminder of how much fairy tales have evolved, as society has moved away from these more chilling origins in favor of happier endings. These dark tales, once the backbone of bedtime stories, serve as both a warning and a mirror. They reflect the fears, struggles, and societal norms of their time, revealing a world far more terrifying and complex than we're often led to believe. Fairy tales were not created to simply entertain. They were used to teach, to warn, and to prepare children for the harsh realities of life. And in many ways, they were a reflection of how life itself could be both beautiful and cruel in equal measure. The transformations we see in fairy tales, whether from beast to prince or the rise of Cinderella from ashes to royalty, are not just about magical occurrences. They're about navigating the darker parts of the human condition: fear, envy, violence, and survival. The power of these stories lies in their ability to touch on those universal themes, emotions, and experiences that have always defined the human condition. But what if I told you that there are even darker tales, forgotten ones, buried deep in history? Tales that were too horrifying to share, even in a world where brutality was an everyday occurrence. Tales that have been lost to time, waiting to be uncovered? Stay with me, because the world of fairy tales is about to get even darker. If you found this exploration of the dark origins of fairy tales intriguing, you'll love the other mysterious and eerie stories hidden in the pages of history. Be sure to check out my channel for more deep dives into the weird and unsettling past. And don't forget to watch my video on Weird Histories, where we uncover more of the strange and twisted stories that history books won't tell you. Hit the subscribe button and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a tale from the darker side of history. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and always question the stories you've been told.